Well, hello and welcome to another guest interview here on the Profit with Law podcast. I'm your host, Moshe Amsel, and this is going to be a podcast episode that's a little bit different than our norm. It's going to be for those of you who have been secretly fantasizing about writing a novel or a memoir, or maybe there's a book in you somewhere. You've thought about being an author, you want to write a book, but I mean, how do I navigate doing that when I'm a lawyer? Law firm owner, I mean, it's hard enough to be able to balance the juggling act of the actual work I'm doing, growing my business, and my life on the on top of that. Now I'm going to add a book to the mix. How do I get it all done? That's what we're going to be talking today with Mary Adkins about. Mary Adkins is a writing coach, founder of the Book Incubator, a 12-month program to write, revise, and pitch your novel or memoir. She's author of the novels When You Read, Privilege, and Palm Beach. And there's accolades for each of those books. I'm skipping over those, but she's, best book of whatever. Her books have been published in 13 countries, and her essays and reporting have appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic Slate, and more. She's a graduate of Yale Law School, so a fellow lawyer in the room. Not with me, with my listeners. I'm not a lawyer. And Duke University. She helps aspiring authors finish their books with joy and clarity. You can apply for the Book Incubator by going to apply.maryadkinswriter.com. We'll ask her to share that again at the end of our interview. Mary, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
It's my absolute pleasure to have you. And as my surprise and delight when we started our conversation is like, okay, why is this relevant to my listeners? And we kind of navigated that a little bit, and I worked that into the intro. But you were a lawyer. You left the industry and went somewhere else. Give us some of the backstory. Tell us a little bit about you and how in the world did you make that decision and do you regret it? Like, are you happy? Like, what happened?
Mhm. Yes, I am happy. I was not a lawyer for very long. I was only a lawyer for 7 months, so I was the shortest tenured lawyer at the law firm where I was working. Actually, they told me I should set the record. I didn't leave for really any reason other than the main one, which was that I wanted to be creative and I wanted to write novels. And that's something I had wanted to do since I was very young. I was also interested in law, and it made more practical sense as a direction to go, and I enjoyed law school. But it became clear to me once I started practicing that what I really wanted to focus on was writing. And so I left law to write and started working on writing fiction pretty soon after that, working on my first novel. It took me 6 years to write and find a publisher for my first novel. And so through that process, I learned a lot about how not to do it, both in terms of writing a novel specifically and also in terms of writing a publishable book and learning how to get published. It's a really opaque process to try to find a publisher if you're not going to self-publish, if you're going to go the traditional route. And so by the time I finally got there, I realized I had learned a lot that would be valuable to teach other people. Again, both in terms of like getting a book written and finding a way to get it published. And that's when I started teaching and coaching writing. So now I work with writers who have, like you put it, have books in them. I specifically work with people writing novels and memoirs, although I have also coached people writing nonfiction books. And a lot of my clients are working attorneys.
My daughter, Mimi, who is the producer of this podcast, would love to write a book. It's been something that she's been wanting to do. And she wants to write fiction. She wants to write
Cool.
a novel. So she's gonna listen to this episode, and
Great.
her face is gonna light up. She's gonna be really excited to have our conversation. So I got to keep that in mind when I'm
Cool.
directing questions to you. Like, what would Mimi be asking? Um,
Yeah.
but let's talk about our listener base. I mean, let's just say somebody already knows that they want to write a book. It's something they've been pushing off. They just can't figure out how they're going to navigate doing that in addition to everything else that they're doing. What advice do you have for them to be able to figure out, like, is now the right time? Like, when is the right time, and how do I navigate adding that to probably a very busy schedule.
Yeah. So one thing I tell a lot of the people I work with, not just lawyers, are very busy. So they tend to be working professionals, parents, like they're juggling a lot. And so when they come in, and I think this is one reason they end up joining the book incubator, my program, is that it's all about finding these pockets of time to get it done. Because a common misconception, which is a very understandable misconception, is that a book is this big thing that's going to take hours a day. And if you don't have hours a day, it's not the right time. But for many of us, we will never have hours a day like that. We will never write it then because that's just never going to materialize. Maybe it will in retirement, but it's probably not going to until then. So for the people who have this book burning in them, it's about finding these pockets of time when they can do it. And what I like to explain is that another common misconception in the creative writing world, but it also it surpasses the creative writing world, is that um, the first draft should be any good at all. Like that it should be even readable. And once we get over that, like the first draft is I've heard it said, like the first draft is one version of a story, and we're just trying to get something on paper so that then we can work at it and work on it to make it better. And when we really lower the bar, like just super, super low, it means there's no need to edit as you go because you don't even know what it is yet. Like the inner editor is not even good at their job yet. They don't even know what this is. So they're editing based on no standards. And so the goal is just to get words on the page. And if the goal is just to get words on the page, people find that they actually write much more quickly than they think they do because they're thinking about the times they've sat there paralyzed and rewritten the same sentence over and over. And yes, in that case, it took 30 minutes to write 50 words. But if you're not reworking it over and over because you understand this is just one version, my editor in my head isn't even good at their job yet, they can often churn out 500 words in an hour, sometimes like 1,000 words in an hour. Sometimes if they don't even have an hour, it's like, okay, well then I'm going to write 300 words in 30 minutes. A book, a typical adult length novel or memoir or prescriptive kind of self-help nonfiction business book, all of these are around 70,000 words. So let's say someone can, when they're not editing as they go, write about 1,000 words in an hour. If they did that, right, like let's say they were actually able to write for an hour a day, which I know is like a stretch for some people, but I just want to keep the math simple for myself. If they were able to write an hour a day, that's a full draft of the book in 70 days, like just a little bit over 2 months. If they can't write that much or that frequently, an hour a day, then it's like, okay, maybe it takes them 4 months, but 4 months is very fast. Like that just comes and goes. And sometimes like when people hear that really simple math, it can sometimes be a permission slip to be like, wait a second, like I don't have to wait until I have over 10 hours a week or tens of hours a week to work on this. I could write for 45 minutes 4 days a week or 30 minutes 5 days a week and still have an entire draft within a season. And no, it's going to, or yes, it's going to be messy. But what the irony of all of this is, and I mentioned I had worked on my novel for 6 years, rewriting it over and over again and taking all of these writing classes. The people who took 3 years to write the first draft also had a very messy draft. Like it's not less messy because you edit as you go. Because again, the editor isn't good at their job yet. So it's just about getting that first draft down, and everything from there is easier. I mean, revision is work, but once you have something to work with, it's light years easier for most of us because um you can get your analytical brain involved, which tends to be what we're all actually a place where we're really comfortable mentally, and start assessing what's working and what's not and making judgment calls. So
Yeah,
long-winded answer.
it makes a lot of sense. I mean, look, this podcast, I produce it by recording 6 episodes in one day. We batch the recordings, and it's kind of the same thing where if I try to put on my, I'm doing client work before I do a recording, and then after the recording, I'm doing, business oversight or whatever. Like switching those hats and doing those different things, really costs a lot of productivity and a lot of time. Um, where if I know that all I'm doing is just showing up and having a conversation with somebody, I can do that all day long and I can knock a bunch of them out. And I see how that can work with writing a book as well. Where, I'm if as long as I'm not being critical of
Yeah.
how I'm saying it, that I can just spew on a piece of paper, or on a screen. But and then also like it's a lot easier to find a flaw and to fix it when it's already
Yeah.
there to look at,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Exactly. And I was just gonna say, I think sometimes it's like people freak out when I'm like, turn off that editor, like don't be critical when you're doing it. But it's not saying you're never going to be critical. We're not saying we're just gonna like spew a bunch of content and then put it out into the world. The time for criticism comes. It's just phase two, phase three. Like it's just not phase one, right?
yeah, absolutely. So, all right. I buy into this idea that if I could do 30 minutes or an hour a day, within 60 to 120 days, I can have the first draft of my book written. And then I start going through the editorial process of cleaning it up and going, and having my second draft, my third draft, etc. And clearly you think that somebody can have a book in within 12 months, and find a publisher. So is this, I mean, do you have any tips, tricks for you? I mean, so you even told me you work with a bunch of lawyers as well. Um, any insight onto how to get that 30 to 60 minutes a day? I mean, before we even start anything else, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, that's great, but I don't even have 30 to 60 minutes. How do I get that?
Well, in the busiest times of my life, I've woken up early because I mean, I run a small business, I have a kid. Um, and there have been times when I moved this year. So like there have been times when the only time I have to do it is at 5 a.m. Doesn't sound fun, but it works that way. And it actually is fun. I mean, that's the kind of, I think that's the cool thing about creative for the people who have the drive to do it. Like it ends up being fun once you actually find the time and do it. Um, I mean, I worked with a doctor who was like recording on her phone in between seeing patients, just dictating into her notes app. So I think that's the other piece is like I think it's a good to remind ourselves that writing doesn't have to be sitting down at a computer and typing. Like it can be dictating, it can be writing in a notebook, it can be typing with your thumbs on the notes app of your phone, like all of in a carpal line or something. Like all of these things count as writing. That doctor wrote an entire novel that way. She wrote an entire novel in the notes app of her phone. So, and that's, there are writers who talk about how they'll write on index cards walking around, or like I said, a lot of dictators. I've tried dictating and it hasn't worked for me, but I know, it's worked for others. Um, so I think it's that. And I think in terms of, I think a lot of finding those 30 minutes comes down to wanting it enough because, when we want something enough, we tend to find time for it. It's like we find time to watch Netflix or we find time to go to sleep or whatever it is if we want it enough. And so one thing I find really can help with getting someone excited about bringing their idea to life is finding a kind of spirit guide book that is like the one you want to write. And this works really regardless of what kind of book you want to write. If you want to write a novel, find someone who wrote a novel that's a lot like the one that you want to write. Memoir, same thing. Nonfiction, same thing. And then kind of hack it, their structure. Like, how do they open? What do they do in the first chapter? What are they doing on the first 3 pages? What is my version of that? And you can get pretty far into a project just being inspired by a particular author's structure, approach, style, whatever it is about their work that feels like, oh, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to emulate. Um, I mean, I obviously, because I coach people in this, I have like a number of tools, but like I feel like this is one in particular that tends to work well because it gets people excited, and it also gives you something concrete to have as your guide, where it's like this person actually did it. This exists now as a book, and I can look to that and like try to kind of follow what they did as my starting point.
Okay, so I figure out I'm going to wake up early, or I'm going to stop watching Netflix for a little bit, or whatever it is, and I'm going to have that time. I'm going to find that time. I'm going to dictate into a phone, whatever it is that I need to do to get this written. Um, what's next? So I did my first draft. Now what?
Okay, so then it's really important. I tell everyone that I know and work with to set it aside because you are really close to it and you're in it. You're effectively like it's an extension of you still. So what happens almost invariably, I don't know that I've ever seen an exception to this, certainly not in my own life, is when you go back and read something that you just wrote like yesterday, you hate it. Everyone hates it. Um, or you think it's the best thing that's ever been written. People tend to kind of fall into two camps. It's like a love or hate reaction, and neither of those are real or rational. Or they're real in the moment, but they're not, you have no objectivity, and that's why like it's this extreme thing. So I find the sweet spot for me is setting it aside for about 6 weeks. Some people are able to do it for a shorter amount, like 3 to 4 weeks, but per, I don't know that I know anyone who's been able to do it for less than 3 weeks, just to come back and get a little bit of distance from it. It's like sometimes I'll say like if you come back to it and you read a couple sentences and you remember writing them, it's too soon. And of course you're gonna remember what the content of the book is, obviously, but like it should feel a little bit like someone else wrote it, a little bit like I don't remember this exact sentence or phrasing, because when you have that distance, it's much easier to see clearly like what you actually like and don't like, what is as a reader, not just as the person who wrote it. So letting some time pass and then coming back and reading it and really trying to read it like someone else wrote it, because that's what's going to give you the clarity to know what you want to change and what you want to cut and what you want to, what's great and you want to keep. So and I do find if people let enough time pass, when they come back, they do experience that clarity. Maybe not around never, there may be parts it's like, I don't know how to fix this, but they seem to be able to recognize like, I do like this, I don't like this, etc.
What do you do for those 6 weeks? Catch up on sleep and watch Netflix?
Yeah. Yeah. That's what
So
I do.
it's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna 2, 3 months, I'm gonna sprint and I'm gonna write this book, first draft, and then I'm gonna take a little break. And for 4 to 6 weeks, I'm just gonna veg out and forget about it.
I
And
mean,
then I
basically,
come back and revisit.
yeah,
Okay,
like I
I
just
like
try to
that.
get my head out of it. I mean, if it's like sometimes I'll joke, people will be like, what do I do? Like, learn German, like, do anything just to not be thinking about your book.
Right.
Because sometimes they're just like, well, I decided to use this time to actually like write a synopsis of my book. And it's like, that's not, that kind of defeats the purpose because you're still in it if you're doing that. So,
It's such a hard thing to do. It's kind of like here, I had a baby at the hospital, and now I got to give the baby to somebody for
yeah,
4 weeks and then wait,
yeah, it
and
is
then
like
I
that.
get to take it home.
Yeah.
Like, all right.
Yeah,
So,
it's baking. I mean, I really like the oven analogy
right.
because we all understand that something has to bake, right? Like
You made the batter, but now it needs to
it's
form into a
not
cake
done.
or a
Yeah,
cookie. And yeah,
right.
I see that. I see that. Although it's a bad analogy for me because I like to eat the batter. So,
Yeah, that's where it fails.
but all right. So we wait this time. I now go back and I'm doing a broad edit of the entire book. Right. That's the next
Right.
step.
Yeah.
I now have draft number 2 done.
Yes. Yes.
What happens after that?
Oh my gosh, you're so efficient at getting us through this process. This is great. So now is when I would share it with someone. And this is pretty late in the game for a lot of people. They would be like, you don't share this with someone before now, but I really don't recommend it because until now, you just haven't really known what it is. But at this point, you probably, you know what it is. Like you made it, you let it sit, you read it, you saw some things you liked and you didn't, and you tried to make it better. And you've made it, in theory, you've made it as good as you can at this point by yourself. So now it's time to give it to someone else and see what they think. Um,
Now, is that someone
Ideally, it
else your sister, or is that someone else like a professional editor? Like, what
could
does
be
someone else
either.
mean?
Could be either, but I would definitely, I mean, I usually say like try to not pick like your most critical friend who you know is going to rip it apart. It's weird what the kind of masochism that a lot of us have in ourselves, where it's like, well, I gave it to this person I knew would hate it, and it's like, what kind of self-sabotage is that? Like, like if you wrote a thriller and you know this person doesn't read thrillers, like don't give it to them. Like maybe give it to someone else. Similarly, maybe don't give it to the person who loves it, you know, your mom who loves everything you do no matter what and is not gonna actually tell you the truth. Like I think it's you know used good judgment in terms of who you're giving it to, but I don't think it needs to be a professional editor. I do think it is helpful for it to be a couple of people, two or even three, because sometimes when we give it to one, it's just one reader and that person's opinion is now carrying all of the weight. So it's like if
Hmm.
they didn't like the first half of the book, you then decide the first half of the book isn't good, but two other readers would have liked the first half of the book, and this is
Right.
right. So like getting a handful of opinions, I think is pretty critical. It's something I personally always try to do now because I've even been in situations where it's like once I have the book deal and I'm working with an editor, my editor and my literary agent, both professionals in the publishing industry, have completely different opinions about my book. And it's like that kind of experience for me has just driven home that like just how subjective all of this is.
Right.
So, like, never, I mean, one thing I'll sometimes tell people too is like, never rewrite your book based on what one person says. I've also done that. And it's just one person. You just get, oh, sure, rewrite it based on what five people say. But if it's just one person, like, get a second opinion before you do a full overhaul.
So, just to be clear, what is the objective of the people reading the book? Are they giving an overall opinion on the book, kind of like an Amazon review, or are they looking for specific parts of the book that they don't like, or that they, I mean, uh, I
Yeah.
think it would
So,
be important to be clear with them on what you expect from them after they read it so that they're not coming
yeah,
back and saying, hey, you forgot a comma over here and this needs to be capitalized. Like, that's probably
exactly.
not what you wanted.
Yeah, you don't need them to tell you grammar stuff. You don't need them to tell you what kind of book they wish you had written or that they would write, which is what a lot of people will do if you don't give them direction. So, what I recommend doing is asking them to basically just chart three things as they're reading: where they're confused, where they're bored or disengaged, and where they're like wanting to turn the pages and feel like they're engaged, they're either learning something or entertained or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The point is they want to keep turning the pages and they're reading and they're not confused. So it's really that: engaged, bored, and confused. And if you have those reactions for them charted in real time, that's invaluable. I mean, that's really what you want. You don't need their idea for how to like fix something that they're like, well, I just don't like this character, I think you should do XYZ. I mean, maybe they'll give you a good idea, but a lot of times people will kind of give you suggestions that aren't that helpful because you're not going to go that route unless you're very clear to them about what is helpful. And what is helpful is their real time reaction as a reader. And so this could look like, you could you could literally print it out for them. You can ask them what they prefer. I mean, you could print it out for them and be like, just in the margins, put a check where it's going well, put a question mark where you're confused, and put like an X where you're finding it boring and don't want to keep turning the pages. That's all I need from you. That would be great. Um, or you can have them, just mark it on a sheet, physical or digital, but like as they go, like page number, and then kind of from this page to this page, I'm feeling good. Just kind of make a list. But I would just keep it really simple like that. And it keeps it simple for them too that way. And then afterward, you can always have a more substantial discussion about the book, ask them questions you have, because I'm sure we always have questions like, did this part specifically work for you? Or what did you think of this part? And that's like a more qualitative conversation after the fact. But yeah, going into their read, I would just ask them for some basic reactions.
Okay. So now I've got the feedback from my readers, whoever they are, and I have to decide whether I want to do something about that feedback, right? Like, okay, was
Right.
that enough reason for me to go back and rewrite a part of this or whatever? And I take that action, and now I'm done with that step.
Yeah.
Am I now ready to go pitch this to a publisher? Like, where are we at now?
So really quickly to that point, I also like to caution against any kind of, and maybe this is obvious, but against any kind of wholesale acceptance of feedback. So every piece of feedback, and I was guilty of this too for a long time. I was so aware of how much of a novice I was that I assumed that if someone said something that sounded smart, they were right and I was wrong. Like, so I should do it. Like that was just my chain of logic. And as a result, I mean, this is why my novel took me 6 years to write, because I wrote it based on smart sounding feedback by dozens and dozens of people in writing classes I was taking. And it ended up being this like book written by committee, which
Hmm.
I needed to trash and then just completely write from scratch again, trusting my own vision. So every piece of feedback should be filtered through your gut. Like, do I like this feed? Do I agree? Do I think this will make the story better or not? Because just because something sounds smart doesn't mean it's going to make the story better.
Right.
Like the story that you're wanting to tell, sometimes I've noticed people will give this beautiful feedback and it sounds so genius. And then I realize like, oh, they're describing a book that I'm not writing. Like they maybe would want to write that book or someone else could, and could be a great book, but that's not this one. So like, don't be, it's really tricky. Like I still struggle with this, but just because something sounds brilliant doesn't mean it's suitable for you, the book that you're writing. Um, sometimes the feedback takes the form of literary critique, which like also has a place, but that's different from feedback that you should incorporate into the thing itself. It's like, oh, this made me think about XYZ and wonder XYZ. And you think, I guess I should put all of those things you just said into the book. And it's like, no, that's just a reaction a reader's going to have when they're reading. They're going to think about these other things, but that doesn't mean those things need to be in the draft.
Sounds to me like the filter you need to have is, did they point out something that could be a point of confusion or clarity for my character or for the events that are transpiring without altering my storyline and my vision of what I wanted to have
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah.
and as long as it's something that adds to it
Yeah.
or enhances it, then it's okay to go back and put it in. But the moment that it's completely changing the storyline, I need to do a stop and say, okay, is this really the story I wanted to write, or
Yes.
do
Yeah.
or am I sticking with my original plan?
Yeah, and I think the other thing about feedback, not to harp on this too much, but I could talk about this all day, is that, our I don't know why we do this as human beings, but like our way of fixing things, I find tends to be additive. Like we think, oh, I'll fix this by particularly when it comes to feedback on writing. It's like I'll fix this by adding something. I'm going to clarify this. I'm going to add thoughts on this. And what you end up with a lot of times is like a bloated draft because you're trying to address all of these concerns, which tend to be addressed not by cutting, but by adding. And adding is not always good for a draft of anything because our goal is to keep readers turning the pages and for it to feel compelling and tight. And so if it's like, oh, I wanted to hear more about her childhood. Well, now there are 7 paragraphs on her childhood and the plot itself is really flagging because the reader's like, weren't we? I was like engaged in what was actually happening. I don't need to hear right now 7 paragraphs about when she was 4 years old. So, yeah, just being aware of how feedback is going to lend itself to adding more, to building out, to like growing, and growth there needs to be some tension there. There needs to be um some pulling back on that in order to keep it keep it readable, because most of us don't want to sit down with an 800-page book, and many publishers aren't going to publish an 800-page book.
Right.
So
Okay.
yes,
So we got through the feedback piece. I know that we can talk for an hour just on that. Um, what happened? And we're almost out of time. So I just want to cover from there to my book is
yeah,
on the shelf in the airport or whatever. Like, what happens from I got my feedback. I have my this time it's the third draft, right? Um,
yeah.
where where does this project get finished?
So this is where very soon, I mean, very soon after this, and this will be the writer's discretion. I think it's ready to start sending it out. So by that I mean you could either send it to literary agents, who are people who will pitch your book to major publishers. They're often called the big five. A lot of them don't take, the ones you often think of, like Simon and Schuster, Penguin Random House. Most of them don't take submissions directly from authors. You have to have a literary agent, which means your next step is finding a literary agent, sending your book to those people to find one. You can also be pitching it directly to some smaller independent publishers, though, that do take submissions directly from authors. And this is where, yeah, this is where this would come in. You start sending it out. You get feedback from these people too. Oftentimes, they'll say, "Oh, I like it, but I want it to open. I want the first 30 pages cut, or I really want you to change your ending." So usually this process is a little bit iterative. So you got some back and forth where you're doing more revising as you do it. But the ultimate goal at this point is to find either an agent to sell your book to a publisher, or find a publisher who buys it from you directly.
Okay. Um, does it ever happen for somebody to get an advance on their book before they write it?
Um, it can happen with memoirists or for nonfiction book authors who write a full proposal first. And that's a longer document. It's not just one page. It's probably anywhere from like 25 to 75 pages outlining your whole book. For fiction, no, they have to write the full book first.
Got it. Okay, very interesting. For just out of curiosity, just to as the final step in this conversation, um, it's great for anybody who's has a book in them, their creative side of them. They've enjoyed listening to our conversation of how it's possible to do it while they're building their law firm, growing their firm, or even if they're just listening to this podcast as a lawyer employed by somebody, that they can do this simultaneously with their career path and objective. Um, what is the potential financial implication of getting a book out there? What, is there a payoff for somebody writing a book and what does that look like?
So I actually looked into this a few years ago, just did a bunch of research gathering up author advances, that the ones who had reported their advance sizes, and did find some interesting data around it. I think the average advance size across all of these different book types was around $60,000, 60. That obviously varies by all kinds of things. Genre, especially memoir, nonfiction, fiction. But an advance is typically, no matter the size of it, it's paid to the author um, in in several parts. So the standard in the U.S. is 3 parts, sometimes 4. But like you get a third of whatever your advance is, whatever the size is. When you sign the contract, you get a third when your book goes to production, goes to press, and you get a third when it hits the shelves. And that advance is an advance on your royalties, why it's called an advance. But 95% of books don't earn out their advance. So I think it's important for aspiring authors to understand this, that like, because it's something I didn't know, that like when you hear advance, it really is, 95% likely going to be what you make on the book. It's actually not an advance, that's your payout. And then for 5% who kind of win the lottery, they will actually get royalty checks on top of that. The good news is you don't have to pay back your advance. So if you don't earn it back, I mean, it's still, if you don't sell enough books to equal your advance, it's still money that you get to keep as the author.
And is there specific things that are indicative of you prob most likely having a hit that is going to exceed the advance, like making it to a bestseller list or something like what
Yeah.
are there things like that that you could pinpoint and say, yeah, if your book ends up here, most likely you're going to sell enough copies that you'll exceed that advance.
So it's sort of a, I mean, that's like the $1 million question that everyone's trying to answer. I mean, there are authors who think, well, if you get a big enough advance, it must mean that you're going to get hit it big, because why would a publisher pay you $2 million unless they're going to invest all the marketing dollars needed to really make this a success? But then, there are many stories of books that got seven-figure advances and did not make bestseller lists. And so, I mean, interestingly, there was an antitrust trial, the Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster antitrust trial last year, where the publishing executives gave a lot of testimony around these figures, and it was really illuminating, I think, for a lot of us who are interested in the inner workings of the publishing industry, because kind of what came out of it, and people were laughing a little bit at it, is that like no one really knows what makes a book take off. Like it's just sort of, you throw it out into the world. It's like throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. I mean, I think the books, the advanced size of the book is like the best, I think, measure of what people in publishing think is going to do well. Because if a book is going to auction, for example, which is what happens when multiple publishers want to buy it, I mean, that tends to, it's like, it means multiple publishers want to buy it, which means they think it will be successful. That drives up the price, and now there's hope. But again, there are like way more stories of those books not hitting it big than hitting it big. And so that's not a great measure either. So I think I don't know, your guess is as good as mine.
Got it. Okay. Um, Great conversation, Mary. Really appreciate you being here, and really a different topic that not really covered on this podcast all that much. So I really
Yeah.
enjoyed the discussion. I don't think I have a novel in me, although I'm one of those people that, like, when we're talking about it, I'm like, oh, maybe I could write a novel. Like, maybe that's that's
Yeah.
something I could do. Start thinking about what I would write about. But when I was thinking about it, I would just draw parallels to my own life and create a
Mm.
story from there. So don't know that would go over very well, or have many different books coming behind it. So, but I do think there are people who perhaps they are ready. And for those people, I want to give you an opportunity to share how they can get in touch with you, learn more about what you have to offer, and maybe you can help them with getting that book out there. So why don't you share that with us?
Sure. So I have a podcast called The First Draft Club, and it's just, I share writing tips and strategies if they want to check that out. It's very short and sweet episodes to fit into your day. It's just me talking and sharing ideas. And then my book writing program is called The Book Incubator. If they want to learn about that, it's thebookincubator.com.
Awesome. Folks, we're going to link all that up in our show notes. Show notes can be found in the description of your podcast player, as well as on our website at profitwithlaw.com. We encourage you to check it out. If it's something that you're interested in, get in touch with Mary, see how she can help you. And definitely, when your book is published, send me a copy so I can read it and talk about it, and help you promote it and put it out into the world. Really, really good conversation, and thoroughly enjoyed being here behind the microphone. And I hope that this was also enjoyable for my listeners. Folks, we're here every single Thursday with a brand new episode highlighting somebody amazing, bringing you expertise, knowledge, ideas, things that you can do and take action on. And we're excited to do that for you. And the day I'm recording this is December 19th. I know you're going to listen to this. It's going to be well into 2024. But I'm excited for what 2024 is going to bring for all of us. And I'm super excited about some of the guests that we've had and are going to have. So stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and tune in next Thursday. We'll see you then. Take care.